This week we introduce qualitative research methods, namely field research, which is also known as ethnography, and interviews. As you will see, these methods provide very different types of data and so answer different types of questions. The previous two methods, survey and experiments, offered quantitative data. This one offers qualitative data. The subtitle for this chapter is great. It's true. Qualitative research might seem a lot like people watching or listening, but importantly, it's systematic. You have a clear plan of how your people watching and listening will answer your research question. In this presentation, we'll review the general features of qualitative research, and we will evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of these methods. To begin, let's look at the two example studies from the book. Robert Smith's Mexican New York is a study of transnationalization of Tijuanese immigrants to New York. Dr. Smith asked, how does continuing contact with their nation of origin affect assimilation in their new country in the U.S.? To answer this research, Dr. Smith conducted research into Tijuana, Mexico, and New York City between 1991 and 2005. A second example study is Jessica Vasquez's Mexican Americans Across Generation. In this study, she examined Mexican American families and asked, how do different generations develop a sense of racial identity? To answer her question, she conducted interviews with members of 29 three-generation families. Two features of qualitative research is that it relies on either or both observations and interviews. Observation means direct observations of behavior rather than indirect observations, which is what surveys or interviews provide us. Observations also take place in a natural setting where actions are taking place naturally, even if you weren't conducting research on it. For example, if you're studying classroom behavior, rather than interviewing or asking survey questions about how a student acts in the classroom, which would be indirect observations, you would instead spend time in the classroom to have a direct observation of how students are actually acting. This is the primary method for field research or ethnography. Interviews can complement field research observations and offer cross-checks on those observations. In-depth interviews are also often used as a standalone method. They provide rich, detailed information on participants' experiences and interpretations. And to achieve this level of detail, interviews are often rely on open-ended questions, meaning that you allow the respondent to answer the question in their own words. So pause the presentation to answer the following question. Which of the example studies relied mostly on observation, and which one relied mostly on interviews? So remember, we had Robert Smith's study of Mexican New York and Jessica Vasquez's study on multi-generational Mexican Americans. Okay, so if you reviewed those two example studies, you should have realized that Robert Smith relied on observation. He conducted an ethnography, although he did supplement his field research with interviews as well. Jessica Vasquez, she relied mostly on interviews, but she also relied on some observations. For example, how participants acted during the interviews or how their homes might reflect Mexican American heritage. However, Robert Smith relied mostly on observation and Jessica Vasquez relied mostly on interviews. So what are some of the other general features of qualitative research? One is that it uses supplementary archival and other data. So this includes documentary evidence and statistics that can be used to contextualize a study, as well as other records that enhance the observation and interviews. It also relies on non-probability sampling, so non-random selection of field sites, observations, and people, and on qualitative data analysis, meaning that the data generally consists of written text in the form of field notes and interview transcripts. So we do not reduce data to numbers and percentages like we do with survey data. Analysis, furthermore, occurs throughout the process of data collection, not at the end of the data collection process. So now I'll present a few questions for you to answer regarding these three features. So first, what supplementary data did Robert Smith use in his research on Mexican New York? So you'll find the information on this on page 259 of the textbook. Pause the presentation while you look up this information. Okay, I hope you had time to look up the information. So Smith did use supplementary data, and he used governmental data such as the census to document immigration policies and educational or occupational outcomes of Mexicans in the U.S. So with this additional data, he was able to contextualize the lives of the participants that were in his study. Let's look at the non-probability sampling. So describe how Smith and Vasquez found their samples. You'll find this on page 260 of the textbook. Pause the presentation as you look up this information. Okay, so we'll return to the presentation and take a look at the answers. Both of them use non-probability sampling. Smith used convenience sampling and purposive sampling. So he used convenience sampling because he knew about, so the town that he chose in Mexico, he knew about it from earlier research on a different town. So that's a definition of convenience sampling. Purposive sampling, he decided that this town would be a good example to use because Tijuana was an extreme example of a Mexican town where so many of its residents migrated to the U.S. So he had a purpose for choosing this town in his sample. Vasquez, she also used non-probability sampling, and she had purposive sampling as well and snowball sampling. So purposive sampling, she was looking for people with particular characteristics, racial and ethnic characteristics, as well as immigration status. So she was very purposive in choosing her sample. She also used snowball sampling, meaning that after she would interview a respondent, she would ask them if they could recommend other possible participants. While I don't have a question to ask about the qualitative data analysis, I will point you to Smith's description of Don Emiliano and Don Gerardo in the textbook. As you read this description of his interactions with them, you'll get a sense of the depth that Smith's data provides. So he relies on interviews as well as observations of how these two men acted to understand gender and migration. Something else that you might notice, especially in the last excerpt from his book, is that his theory developed as fieldwork continued. This flexibility is another important aspect of qualitative research that we'll discuss later when we look at the strengths of qualitative research. A last general feature of qualitative research is reflexivity. This is the practice of reflecting on your own characteristics and presence and how they shape the research process. So this involves reflection on the impact of insider-outsider status in the field setting. Taking a look at the two example studies from this chapter, can you find an example of how Smith and Vasquez engaged in reflexivity? And are they insiders or outsiders in their research? Pause the presentation as you look for this answer. Okay, we'll return to the presentation and look at the answers. So Smith, he was an outsider. He was a white American studying Mexican-American immigrants in the US and Mexicans in Mexico. So he was very conscious of his outsider status, and he points to an example of how he felt when he was racing during the feast of Padre Jesus, of how everyone was looking at him because he was an outsider. Vasquez, on the other hand, she was an insider. And she discusses how being an insider allowed her to pass the first test of authenticity for her participants who could connect with her Mexican-American heritage as well. Reflexivity is a very important aspect of qualitative research, and as you engage in your interviews and even in your surveys, I want you to consider how are you impacting or shaping the research process with your presence. Are you an insider or an outsider? To review, some of the general features of qualitative research include observation, interviews, knowing that many qualitative researchers use a combination of both, even though they rely mostly on one or the other. Qualitative research also uses supplementary, archival, and other data to provide context for their study. It uses non-probability or non-random sampling. And the analysis is a qualitative data analysis, meaning that you're analyzing textual data of the written word rather than numbers like you do in a survey. Lastly, whenever you engage in qualitative research, you always think deeply about the reflexivity. How are you changing the process by your presence in the field? This is a good time to review something that we discussed at the beginning of the semester, the definition of qualitative research questions. A qualitative research question is a question that asks about social processes or the meaning and cultural significance of people's actions. So reviewing Smith and Vasquez research question, how do these questions reflect this definition? So if you wish, you may pause the presentation to reflect on this question, but I'm going to go ahead and explain how I believe that they reflect a qualitative research question. Robert Smith's question, how does continuing contact with nation of origin affect assimilation? So this question is definitely qualitative. It's examining the social process of assimilation. It's also looking at the cultural significance of the homeland and adopted land. What are the meanings that they hold for the people involved? Vasquez is also asking a qualitative question. How do different generations develop a sense of racial identity? She's looking at the social process of how we form our identity. And she's also looking at the meaning and significance of this concept of race. So for both these questions, qualitative methods are the best way to answer them. And in fact, these researchers employ expertise in answering their question. To end, let's review some of the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research. So there's a number of really great reasons why you would want to use qualitative research. One is because of its naturalistic approach. Qualitative research involves observing people in their natural settings and allowing people to describe their feelings and experiences in their own words. Related to this, it also provides you with a subjective and contextual understanding, so you're able to gain an insider's view of people's worlds. After speaking with them or reading about research that uses qualitative research, you really get a sense of what these people go through. Lastly, it's also very flexible. So the flexible research design allows you to study dynamic situations and settings as they arise. It also allows you to study populations that might be difficult to access. and it allows you to add new pieces or modify research as needed as you go along with your study. Now, for all of its strengths, it also has some weaknesses, like any of these methods. One of them is that it's not very easily generalizable, meaning that qualitative research has a very weak inference compared to quantitative research, so the results cannot be generalized to a specific population. Furthermore, the reliability and validity of the data relies heavily on the skills of the researcher. Lastly, the efficiency. It's a very labor-intensive and time-consuming method. This is the end of presentation 1.